So listen to this. Nowadays a lot of young players get called the next Ronaldo, the next Messi, the next whatever. The entire world has become a little too obsessed with Wonderkids, but back in 2005 that didn't really happen that much, which made it 10 times more shocking when at 10 years old Jean Chera started being referred to as the next Pele. Look, I don't even want to say too much in this intro because I don't want to spoil the story, but if you know nothing about him, let me tell you this is easily one of the most interesting and shocking videos I've posted. Let's just say that at 15, Jean Chera was already being paid millions a year. And just 6 years later, he was being forced to sell his furniture on Facebook Marketplace in order to get by, at one point even sleeping on the street and begging clubs on Twitter to sign him. And the worst of all, according to many, his downfall was all his father's fault. So I think you get what I mean by now. Let's go. Right from the time he was 5 years old, his father was clearly obsessed. He recorded every single one of his games. And to be fair, I get it. Look at that kid, he's insanely good. I'd probably do the same if I was convinced I had the next Messi on my hands. Regardless, for a long time, he kept those videos to himself. It was only when Ja was already 9 years old that a friend of his father convinced him to leave one of the DVDs at the football academy he worked for, and the very next day, the president of the club was calling, completely desperate, offering them everything he possibly could to get the family to move into their town so Ja could join the team. And well, they did. There was only one problem. A year later, one way or another, those DVDs made it to national television. It started with a Sunday afternoon talk show, then it was the news, every sports broadcast, magazine and newspaper. Suddenly, Jean Chera was the most famous kid in the country. He had everyone from Man United, PSV and Real Madrid scouting him, but instead, he opted to slow things down and take it easy, opting to stay in Brazil and join Santos. Still, don't for a second think this wasn't a huge leap in his career. Before the move, he had lived his whole life in the countryside, he had literally never even seen the ocean, and suddenly, he was living in a city with 18 million people, earning 10,000 reais a month, 20 times more than the minimum wage, and signing a sponsorship deal with Umbro. Add to that the fact that he was a left-footed winger who had to go through hormone treatment in order to grow, and before you knew it, he was no longer the new Pele, it was the Messi from Mato Grosso. But the overwhelming comparisons wouldn't stop there, because you see, while Jean Chera was absolutely crushing everyone at Santos Academy, there was another kid who he had to share the spotlight with. Yeah, I'm talking about Neymar, and believe it or not, back then Ja was the one the club referred to as their biggest prospect. He was that guy. But the thing is, Neymar was 3 years older than him, meaning that by the time Ja turned 15 and began negotiating his first professional contract with the club, Neymar was already playing his second season as a pro, where he would pull 42 goals and 15 assists in 60 matches. So, just imagine the kind of expectations that were being put on Ja, who was not even seen as the next Neymar, but the one who was supposed to outdo every single one of his achievements. As one newspaper at the time wrote, Ja lives the life of an adult. He trains with the under-17s in the morning, with the under-15s in the afternoon, and attends class at night. And everywhere he goes, his fans follow. In fact, had a law not been passed just a year or two before forbidding any kids younger than 16 from playing professional football in Brazil, he would probably have debuted even earlier. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, with Ganso and Neymar already on the team, and even with Gabigol being the same age as him, Jean Chera would be the next one to become a star at Santos. All they needed was that contract, and man, here's where everything went crazy. You see, despite all the media craze, over the previous years there had actually been a lot of problems between Ja and the club. Or, I guess I could say, between his father and the club. So, the guy was a bit paranoid, he was absurdly protective, and over the years he began convincing himself that many people at the club were trying to sabotage his son's career because they were jealous of his success. If you asked him, he would tell you that when the coaches didn't call him up for the games, it was because they were jealous. When his teammates wouldn't pass him the ball, it was because they were jealous. He was convinced that everyone was working against him, but if you asked the club, you would get a different story. When they got to negotiating his contract, it was his father who made sure to make it as messy as it could get. Just picture this. When Neymar got his first professional contract 2 years earlier, he was being paid 20,000 reais a month. Jean was already earning 30,000 before he even made it as a professional, and now his father was asking that they tripled it. In fact, not only was he asking for 90k in his first year, he wanted his salary to be increased every year from there on out, 110k in his second year, and 130k by the third. Oh, and that's if you put aside another minor request, a sign-on fee of 1 million reais. And believe it or not, it gets even more ridiculous than that, because his father, despite asking for all that money, wanted to keep half of the player's rights and 70% of his image rights. And, well, once the club rejected all of this and instead proposed that the player kept the same wage while getting some extra bonuses as well as a fair share of his image rights, the father went completely ballistic. It was one public statement after the other, constantly degrading the club's name, insisting that every big club in Europe was after them, and by the time the weekend rolled around, he was off on a plane to Italy negotiating his son's transfer to Genoa. As the Santos president at the time would state, "Those with big mouths don't get fed. We're not crazy, there's no certainty that he'll become world class. If he wants to leave, he can leave. One thing is sure, I'll never pay him what his father demanded." And the worst thing is that these negotiations weren't even the worst stunt his father pulled while at Santos. But we'll get there. Regardless, you gotta give him one thing. Only days later, Jean did sign a 3-year contract with Genoa, and according to many sources, not only was he earning the equivalent of 200,000 reais a month there, but he also got a great sign-on fee, a car, and a beachfront 2-story house with a pool. Had everything been fine, we would be calling his dad a genius, but instead, well, the club wasn't able to get him a visa before the registration window closed, then they got in trouble for even trying to register a non-European underage player, and after being threatened with relegation by the FA, they were forced to terminate his contract. Sure, Jean probably got a great payout, but out of nowhere, he was left without a club. And you know what's funny in all of this? There's literally this thing the fans call the Santos curse, where any player who leaves Santos for free ends up completely destroying their own careers. So, I guess he can't say that he wasn't warned. Nevertheless, by November, he settled on a deal to join Flamengo, but after years of constantly being the most outstanding player at every youth level, once he got there, things slowed down abruptly, and 1 year later, the 17-year-old wasn't even getting selected for the under-17s, which eventually led Flamengo to terminate his contract. But again, people wondered what changed, and the answer was simply nothing. According to him, he wasn't playing because the club wasn't paying him, and according to the club, he wasn't playing because they simply did not want to have to deal with his father anymore. But hey, at least this led to one thing. I'm not sure if it was Zhao who stood up to him or what the hell happened, but once the dust settled, the father finally stopped representing him, got him a proper agent, and the guy got him a new deal at Athletico Paranaense. But again, after just 6 months, the club claimed that not only had he failed to impress, but according to them, even though by now he wasn't even handling the financial side of it all, his father was still absolutely unbearable. And you see, it was at this point that some reporters began catching on to the fact that seemingly every club kept complaining about his father, so they went and began investigating what exactly was wrong with the guy, interviewing everyone they had ever worked with, and the stories that came out were absolute insanity. It's hard to even decide where to start, but let's go. So, back at Santos, things got so bad that at one point his father literally forced Jean to leave the pitch midway through a match because he was upset at his teammates, which literally led the club to ban him from entering their grounds. On another occasion, a coach subbed off Jean at halftime, and his father got so paranoid that the coach was sabotaging his career that he got the board to sack the poor guy. As that coach would tell the press, that kid is the victim of a crazy father who picks fights with everyone. At one point, Palmeiras wanted to sign him, but once negotiations started, they had to stop the meeting because they simply couldn't stand his father. Jean is a good kid, but his father ruins everything for him. Another coach even claimed that Jean used to be a really hard-working kid, but at one point, he began refusing to practice his heading and his weak foot. He even began refusing to track back, and when they asked him why, he claimed his father had told him that the best players always stay up front where they can shine the brightest. So, yeah, great advice, my guy. And if you're wondering about the whole Genoa fiasco, let me tell you that he also found the agent that worked as a middleman in all of that, and he completely spilled the beans. Not only did he confirm what the other guy had said about the meeting with Palmeiras, but he told the reporters that the father would constantly go back on his word in negotiations, always trying to get more and more money, and that at Genoa, the problems with the visa weren't the club's fault. It had actually been the father who had promised the club that he could get it all done, despite the club insisting it wasn't possible. And it all culminated with the father getting into some serious altercation with the president of the club and being told to pack his bags and leave. Oh, and of course, at Flamengo, an unnamed employee also told them that the biggest problem was his father. He was always complaining, always questioning everyone, demanding stuff. Everyone got tired of dealing with him. Regardless, let me tell you, the curse wasn't over, because even after all of this got uncovered, Jean managed to find new ways to hit rock bottom. Still banking on his reputation as the next Neymar. After all, keep in mind that at this point he was only 18, he ended up joining Cruzeiro on a short-term contract, but he wasn't even able to see that one through. Halfway into it, his agent told him he had received a proposal from West Ham that even included a sponsorship from Nike. So once Cruzeiro began having second thoughts about including him in the first team and proposed that he go on trial, he began feeling like he could easily get more recognition somewhere else and quit. There was just a little problem. His agent was lying, simple as that. There was no West Ham deal, no Nike, nothing. He was just trying to make himself seem like a big shot. And so, closing in on Ja's 19th birthday, having had either failed stints or failed negotiations with seemingly every big club in Brazil, and with everyone convinced he wasn't capable of making it out of academy football, Ja decided to show everyone he could go pro, so he ended up signing with the West in the Brazilian second tier. But 2 months later, the club was relegated from their regional championship, a huge meltdown started and 11 players got their contracts terminated. And not only was Ja one of them, he hadn't even played a single match for the club at that point because they claimed he was too fat. At this point, he began really freaking out and ended up moving all the way to Romania and joining CSU Craiova, but that transfer ended up breaking every record in the book, and I mean this in the worst way possible. His contract was literally cancelled after only 10 days and a couple training sessions. So, feeling completely lost, he just moved south and joined Paniliakos in the Greek second tier, and actually finally managed to get his professional debut. In fact, he even made 4 appearances for the club, but I have to say, he didn't score a single goal or get a single assist, and the team lost every one of those matches, and so just 5 months after his arrival, the club filed for bankruptcy and got demoted to the 5th division, leading Ja to one of his most depressing moments, being denied entry into his hotel once the club stopped paying for his stay, being left stranded without his passport or wallet, not knowing a single word of Greek, and ending up being forced to sleep on the street. Add to that the fact that a few weeks later he was even more humiliated after pretty much begging recently relegated Botafogo for a chance on Twitter. And yeah, it doesn't get much worse than that, except in this case, it actually does, because first of all, Botafogo never replied, and second, Ja ended up in the Spanish 4th division playing for Buelna, where he spent so little time that I literally don't have anything to tell you about it. All that mattered was that after a handful of weeks, he was going back to Brazil in order to sign for Cuiabá, which would become the 10th club of his career, despite the fact he was only 20 years old. Again, after 41 minutes on the pitch, he was released. This time, they claimed he was too out of shape, lacked any commitment to training, and partied too much. But hey, at least the 3rd-tier club somehow won their regional championship, which meant Ja had won a title, so I guess you can make of that what you will. But believe it or not, at this point he actually made it back to Santos, not because they still thought he would become the next Neymar, but out of pity. They got him a 4-month-long contract at 900 reais a month, 100 times less than he had demanded from them just 4 years earlier, and well, only $100 more than minimum wage. Their only goal was to get him in shape and try to help him reignite his career now that his father seemed to truly be out of the picture. So they got him a loan at Portuguesa Santista along with 13 other Santos players in a sort of partnership between the clubs. He even scored 2 goals for them over the first few weeks, including a decisive one right on his debut. But very early into the whole thing, he got seriously injured, and if his mental state was already pretty shaky at that point, after that, he really lost it. He began eating his sorrows away, and before they knew it, he was more out of shape than ever. Even once he made it back from injury, he failed to even show up for practice as he was struggling with his mental health, and the club was forced to terminate his contract, leading him to move back to his hometown with his pregnant girlfriend and hitting the lowest of lows, trying to sell his furniture on his Facebook page so he could save some money for when the kid was born, leading most newspapers to assume this meant he was giving up on football at the age of just 21. However, that wasn't the case just yet. The following day, he'd make sure to announce that he was just taking a break so that he could work on his mental health and spend some time with his son once he was born, and indeed, 6 months later, he ended up joining 4th tier Sinop, but after 1 year and 8 appearances for the club, he finally announced his retirement for good. However, 2,180 days later, just earlier this year at 28 years of age, he finally decided to come back to football after his son began questioning him about his past after finding clips of his dad playing with Neymar on the internet. He has been playing in the 3rd tier of the Paulista Regional Championship ever since, and when finally interviewed about his past, he said, "The pressure was out of this world. They called me everything from new Messi to the white Pele. From there on out, I was never a normal player again. Everyone wanted things to happen too fast. Wherever we went, it was no longer Santos, it was Jean's team. Had things moved more slowly, had I stayed at the club, things could have gone better. By the time I retired, even the thought of football upset me. I couldn't even play with my friends for fun. It was all too much."